let me record my thanks to those who have organised this event. It's an imaginative and timely initiative, and I look forward to the interaction ahead. I'm glad to be included in this exercise as an old dog trying to learn some new tricks on Zoom. I'm aware that much may go wrong, but let's see what happens over the next half hour. When Karl Barth students asked him what they should do in 1933 upon Hitler's becoming Chancellor, he advised them to carry on as if nothing had changed. I've often thought of this in recent weeks. The dangers of offering comment on the current crisis are manifold. Is our craving to be noticed itself a sign of weakness in the academy or wider society? Is it born of a compulsion to appear relevant? Have the humanities felt marginalized as the scientists take central stage? May we be confusing the role of the theologian with that of the preacher whose task it is to speak a word in season? Or has contemporary theology now become so instrumentalized that it must always be adapting itself to the interests of some party or faction? And might it be the case that the theologian's best contribution is to carry on with the core tasks of her calling, confident that the right word will eventually come at the right time? My father-in-law tells me that he's wearied of professors appearing on his TV screen to offer their expert advice. He may have a point. Every bien-pensant feels obliged to have an insight, it seems. Though I have to say I'm impressed by the capacity of some of our scientific colleagues to communicate effectively with wider audiences. Those of us in the humanities might learn something from them. There's also a danger of converting our long-standing prejudices into prognostications. These might be about localism, international cooperation, sustainability, social equality, constitutional arrangements, healthcare funding, the mission and governance of the church, or whatever. The newspapers and social media are rife with such predictions. I've even succumbed to the temptation myself in a recent interview with Life and Work, the magazine of the Church of Scotland. Not all of this is wrong, of course, and we should seek to envision the future. But our hopes ought not to masquerade as confident predictions. We didn't foresee this crisis, nor do we know how it will end. And given so many variables at present, we should openly admit our lack of prescience. The collateral damage to health, education, jobs, and standards of living, especially in the global south, is increasingly evident with each day that passes. This may well result in our speaking about some very different subjects and outcomes in the years ahead. Ours is a time for hard thinking, careful listening, and free debate. The comments earlier this week of Professor Venki Ramakrishnan, President of the Royal Society, provided a measure of calm and model reasoning. By contrast, we should be suspicious of rhetorically amplified claims to know exactly what's happening and what we should do, as if contrary voices were selfish or even seditious. Adam Smith has some wise words from the 18th century. The frequent and often wonderful success of the most ignorant quacks and impostors, both civil and religious, sufficiently demonstrate how easily the multitude are imposed upon by the most extravagant and groundless pretensions. Yet Barth himself did not do nothing. Quietism was never an option. His plea was for renewed concentration on the theological task. By the following year, his own theology had become the dominant influence on the Barmen Declaration, which he drafted with his Lutheran colleagues Bright and Asmussen. This was his form of political protest. At a time of crisis, theologians should recognize the need to hazard an initial contribution when our churches, universities, and seminaries are facing uncertain times and seeking a modicum of wisdom. On balance, it seems better to run the risk of saying too much than nothing at all. I recall someone once saying that Jürgen Moltmann had made such a significant impact on a wider public because he wasn't afraid of being wrong. Maybe he made mistakes and cut some corners, but he succeeded in making a difference. To invert Wittgenstein, we might say, whereof one cannot remain silent, thereof one must speak. Perhaps this is the perennial burden of the theologian. I'm neither Barth nor Moltmann, of course, but here is my tuppence worth under three doctrinal headings. First, the providence of God. I begin with some historical observations. When the Lisbon earthquake struck on All Saints' Day in 1755, thousands lost their lives. Much of Europe then entered into discussion about what God might have intended by this event. For many, it was perceived as a work of punishment upon a wicked population. As an act of God, it must serve some particular intention, it was said. The catastrophic effects betokened judgment and retribution to some, and a solemn warning to the rest. John Wesley warned his hearers that similar seismic events could be expected nearer home if they didn't mend their ways and turn to God in repentance. If this was a dominant view amongst Europe's theologians and preachers, others adopted a more skeptical line, especially Voltaire, the French philosopher. The indiscriminate damage caused by the earthquake did not look like a precision attack on the ungodly. Those commemorating All Saints' Day in the churches suffered high casualties, while others in the city brothels survived unscathed. God's aim wasn't very good, or so it seemed. And why on earth would God act in this way anyway? What story can be told of divine benevolence or the best possible world when so many children died? Pombal, the Portuguese prime minister, was by all accounts a political operator. Yet he recognized the danger of the moment, and he responded by arranging for the burial of the dead, the treatment of the injured, provision of emergency supplies, and protection of the stricken city from looters and pirates. For doing so, he was chastised by some theologians for counteracting what God had surely intended. Yet today we would see Pombal and not the earthquake as the agent of God's providence. That much seems clear. But how and when did this theological shift come about? These questions are worth asking. It seems that a paradigm change had been completed by the end of the Great War in 1918. Theologians had gradually abandoned the exercise of inscribing every event with a particular divine intentionality. Natural catastrophes and terrible accidents were to be explained by scientists and historians, rather than by theologians speculating as to what God had meant by this. When James Begg, a distinguished Scottish Free Church preacher of conservative disposition, suggested that the Tay Bridge disaster of 1879 was the result of trains carrying ungodly passengers on Sundays in a country rife with heterodox teachings, he was rightly derided in the national press. Insurance companies might retain the category of acts of God, but theologians had started wisely to yield the task to others of explanation. Nevertheless, the providential optimism of this era persisted until 1914. If God did not interpose the regularities of nature with occasional catastrophes or deliverances, Nevertheless, the general direction of historical forces was still believed to display a providential pattern that could readily be discerned. The discourse of providence was used frequently and with much confidence through the Victorian era. The growth of empire, the success of free trade, and the missionary expansion of the church, all these were evidence of a divine hand at work in the world. In discerning this benevolent force, we should be grateful, humbled, and invigorated in our best efforts to support these causes, so it was argued. Yet such confident and almost intuitive assumptions around divine providence were largely shattered by the experience of the Great War, when European armies, each persuaded that God was on their side, fought battles of attrition resulting in millions of casualties. Affirmations of divine providence became subdued and somber. Theologians would thereafter be more hesitant and cautious in where they located the hand of God. The evolutionary optimism of the late 19th century now belonged to another age. The war had problematized God's providential actions. Attention turned now towards divine suffering, the crucified Christ, and the eschatological kingdom. Given this shift in worldview that had taken place by 1918, it's worth considering theological responses to the Spanish flu epidemic, which spread just as the war was ending. Astonishingly, this resulted in far more fatalities than the war itself, though one wouldn't guess this while visiting the graves of the fallen in Flanders, or marking their sacrifice around countrywide memorials each November. Estimates of up to 100 million deaths worldwide make the Spanish flu one of the most lethal catastrophes in recorded history. Yet the literature suggests that very few people attempted to see this pandemic as from the hand of God, or as manifesting some special religious significance. Unlike the Lisbon earthquake or the cholera outbreak of 1832, when a national fast day for repentance was held in the UK, attributions of divine causality at the time of the Spanish flu were evident only on the margins of organized religion. Advancing in several ways, the flu was a heartbreaking sequel to the war. Unlike COVID-19, it carried away a disproportionate number of younger people. As we see today, there were, to be sure, some on the fringes who succumbed to the temptation to interpret this as a form of religious karma. But mainstream theological opinion mostly avoided false attributions of divine intentionality or bogus explanations. Here then is the lesson. At a time of crisis, a refusal of some speculative questions may itself be the right response. Often denounced for their phony solutions to his suffering, Job's 3 friends did at least rend their garments. Then they sat silently with him on the ground for 7 days and nights. Our task is not to explain why God sent this pandemic, or even to consider why it was permitted, as if its occurrence were the result of some particular divine cost-benefit analysis. A world of earthquakes, flood, fire, and disease is part of the creation, not yet perfect, but still to be affirmed as the first of God's good works. To paraphrase an earlier defender of evolution, nature comes to us wholesale and not by retail. The troubling why questions, why this, why now, why me, may run deeper in the human psyche than we often admit. But if we do not refuse their terms, we'll make some grievous theological mistakes. There is no one-on-one causal relation between natural disaster and divine intentionality. History should instruct us here. Much better to locate God's providence in the work of those like Pombal, who seek to resist the disease and to mitigate its worst effects. In recent weeks, several writers have commented on the difficulty in praying in the midst of the current crisis. Regular patterns of devotion and trusted books of prayer can suddenly seem out of place. Alison Joyce is minister of St. Bride's Church in Fleet Street, London. In a moving piece in the Times, she recalls her predecessor Richard Pearson electing to remain in post during the Great Plague of 1665, while others sought the safety of the countryside. At grave risk to his own life, he ministered to the dying and the bereaved. Parish records reveal that one day alone he buried 43 people. Several of those who assisted him in this work were carried away by the plague. And musing on all this, Alison Joyce wonders what he might have prayed about during these calamitous times. And what was it that moved him to remain in post? Returning to the Psalms each day, I've been struck by how the lack of interest in speculative questions is matched by an intense awareness of God as present in the struggle. And this is conveyed even when God seems inactive, hidden, or silent. Much is made of waiting and longing, as if God is there always, but is yet to speak or cannot be found. My second theme is on being human. When we turn from God to ourselves, there are some obvious lessons to be learned for theological anthropology. An excessive stress on individual autonomy is yielding again to a greater recognition of our embodiedness, our fragility, and our relationality. Here I'm drawn back to the underrated material in John McMurray's Glasgow Gifford Lectures, The Form of the Personal, first published in 2 volumes in 1957 and 1961. The basic unit of existence, McMurray argues, is not the I of the Cartesian ego, but the you and I together. The self is an embodied agent whose identity is realized only in communion with other persons. In our patterns of learning and living together, we are shaped by our relations with others. An excessive focus on the mind and the autonomous individual self can obscure these more holistic truths. Determined by freedom and love, personhood becomes the measure for political, social, and economic life. Society is to be organized for the welfare of our communities. The current lockdown has brought a realization of how much the stimulus, enjoyment, and motivation of our lives are dependent upon our multiple interactions with others. We've been left listless, frustrated, or even depressed at the loss of social exchanges. Simple pleasures like sharing a coffee or a beer, watching a dire football match, enjoying the gossip of the office, or singing a hymn, these have become poignant memories as if from a distant age. Video links may have provided a lifeline, but these cannot entirely replace the physical presence and proximity of the other. Indeed, the sudden increase in the sale of puppies seems to indicate that the interactions we need are not only with other people, but also with a variety of creatures. One of the tragedies of our care home crisis is that people have had to die without the presence of their families. Elderly parents have made their final journey without the support of those closest to them. Luther once spoke of the importance of shouting in the ears of the dying. We have the responsibility and privilege of ministering to them, of reminding them that they are not alone, that they can breathe their last in the communion of saints. Yet quarantining restrictions have left many to die unaccompanied, except by healthcare workers who've been left heroically to assume this additional burden. Such isolation from loved ones in extremis seems too high a price to pay. Another way will surely need to be identified for any future pandemic. In one of his so-called quarantine quatrains, the poet Malcolm Guite has written, "We used to stroll together on the green, who now divides the squares upon the screen? The faces of our friends so far apart tease us with tenderness that might have been." Though not reducible to material forces, our personhood also reposes upon the physical and biological constitution of our bodies. This too makes us aware of the interconnectedness of parts in the material world, where the whole becomes more than the sum. And this goes all the way down to the microscopic levels where balance and integration are vital. Our way of life is determined to a large extent by the capacity of our bodies successfully to resist the effects of harmful viruses. Though not directly aware of these microbial forces constantly at work, we've become increasingly informed of the delicate structure of our bodies and our dependence on complex biological forces. Dependence and relatedness are essential features of being human. So also is fragility. A way of life that seemed secure and predictable has been shattered in the space of a few weeks. Suddenly the future is unclear, even frightening. Such fragility is evident too in the imperfections inherent in political systems, and by our failure to comprehend fully the unintended consequences of lockdown and isolation. In the time ahead, we may find ourselves considering the consequences of a mental health epidemic that has emerged from the COVID-19 lockdown. My younger son currently works in a psychiatric ward, and he reports that the impact of the current crisis on psychological well-being is already becoming apparent. The need to gather more detailed findings about the spread and differential effects of COVID-19 illustrates the limitations of our knowledge, and this is compounded by the understandable incapacity of politicians always to get it right. When the precedents are few, when scientific opinion is shifting, and when time is of the essence, it's impossible to avoid mistakes. The discharge of infected patients from hospitals to care homes has obviously had disastrous consequences, though these were never intended. Somehow we have to balance critical scrutiny of policy with understanding and support of those placed in demanding and stressful circumstances. We should make some allowances and provide a safe space for our leaders to admit their mistakes, especially in these unprecedented times. This places upon them a corresponding responsibility to consult and to confer, while avoiding pretensions always to know best. Amidst all this, our human vulnerability has been on full display. First-hand reports from COVID-19 wards reveal the incapacities and terrors wrought by the more acute effects of the disease. Healthcare workers know all about these, but the wider population has become more conscious of the physical indignities of serious illness. We're also learning to live with risk and death, though of course we've always had to do so, as did our forebears to a greater extent. But openly acknowledging risk and the possibility of death and factoring these into our daily activities makes more vivid our awareness of human fragility. This heightened consciousness of our precarious hold on life, further feature of the Psalter, might awaken us to a sense of God and the preciousness of our life in this world. I often return to a moving passage from John Updike's novel The End of Time. The aging narrator is making a slow and painful recovery in springtime from cancer surgery. He is struck by the rhapsody of colours he sees from his bedroom window in the trees, shrubs, and landscape outside. Updike writes, "I see now too late that I have not paid the world enough attention, not given it enough credit. The radio between the weather and the stock report releases a strain from Schubert's dry Klavierstücke, melody that keeps repeating, caressing itself in sheer serene joy. And I think of him and Mozart dying young and yet each pouring out masterpieces to the last, rising higher and higher as their lives fall from them, blessing with their angelic ease the world that has reduced them to misery, to poverty, to the filth and fever and the final bed. My eyes cannot help watering, sure sign of senility." Third theme, Christ and the Church. Kant famously said that there are three fundamental questions that confront human beings. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope for? In approaching that third question at the present time, we might ask ourselves if we've become too lacking in hope, or at least too restrictive in the scope of our hopes. This may be a particular problem for those of us in the affluent West, as Leslie Newbigin often claimed after his return from Chennai. But even if localized in this way, it's worth inquiring about the direction and extent of our hopes. Werner Jeanron's recent study, Reasons to Hope, appeared just before the outset of this crisis, and it offers some valuable lines for further exploration. What can or should the followers of Jesus hope for? That strikes me as a way of revisiting some fundamental issues in Christology, particularly with respect to the theme of the kingdom or the commonweal of God, which framed Jesus' own teaching and practice. For too long, this has been associated with a low Christology that viewed Jesus as a religious teacher or moral exemplar, or perhaps as a concept that requires translation or sublimation into the presence of Christ in the life of the church. Yet that seems to me a mistake, insofar as it overlooks or diminishes the organizing concept of Jesus' own ministry. The images of the kingdom are expressed in parables, and its characteristic signs are evident in healings, exorcisms, the feeding of hungry people, the sharing of meals, and the calming of storms. Theories of the person and work of Christ that abstract from this primary context risk losing not only a vital historical connection with Jesus, but the proper integration of personal and social transformation in the Christian life. The reign of God is a reality that is broader than the church, and it is the focus of Christ's own hopes. While its finality is beyond this life, its presence is already here and now, though often hidden in ordinary and unnoticed places. As herald, agent, and living embodiment of the kingdom, Jesus is central to our understanding of it. Yet its trademark signs reveal that it is a reality broader than the church, and that others too are its participants and actors. This works in two ways when we come to ecclesiology. First, those who are not against us may be for us. They are our co-workers in the tasks of healing and restoration. We can salute and share their goals, making them our own. And second, the Church's commitment to advancing the kingdom is essential to its identity as the body of Christ in the world. This makes service a necessary ecclesial function. In this respect, the inclusion in our hopes of others near and far is a responsibility laid upon Christian people. These hopes are to be articulated in prayer and enacted in service. And as Werner Jeanron shows in his recent book, our hope is grounded not in optimistic predictions about the future, but in the faith that the capacious love of God is our source and end, and therefore the measure of all things. Amidst this crisis, the Church may both rediscover itself while also finding new pathways of witness and service. Despite much of the gloom and uncertainty, there are reasons to hope and examples to celebrate. The rapid embracing of digital technology suggests new possibilities for worship education and more efficient governance. Many people may choose increasingly to connect with faith communities by digital means. We should be ready to seize that opportunity, yet without diminishing the importance of being present together in the same place. In turning to our surrounding communities through distributions of food supplies, provision of listening services, and promotion of networks of friendship, we can find that in quite mundane ways, our churches provide valued support during times of real need. The primary form of the church is at the local level, ministering to people in simple but effective ways. As Barth says, we do not really know Jesus if we do not know him as the partisan of the poor. These are only preliminary comments. Everything may look quite different 6 weeks, 6 months, or 1 year from now. My reflections must have a provisional character and a very limited shelf life. But this is probably true of most of the theology we produce. John Henry Newman can speak for all of us. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me.